NASCAR was born in December 1947. As it grew into a stable figure in motorsports, the 1950s were an important decade. While increased automaker support carried NASCAR to bigger heights, the 50s were characterized by odd moments that contributed to the unique charm of early stock car racing. The first Southern 500 in 1950 encapsulated that first decade of NASCAR. It instantly became the showcase event for the series. It had its share of strange moments. Take Herb Thomas, for example, who qualified 29th in a 1950 Plymouth. Unfortunately, when he bought the car from the dealership, he didn't have any money to pay for it once the payments were due. Instead of giving him a chance to win the money in the race, on race morning, a tow truck came to the track and repossessed his race car, keeping him out of the event. Things weren't much better for a fan named Ralph Webb, who drove his 1950 Buick to the track, but wasn't able to drive it home. That's because during the race, someone stole a Piper Cub airplane from a nearby airport and flew it all the way to the parking lot, where he crashed into Webb's parked car. The man, who was drunk, was uninjured. Drinking wasn't just limited to the local pilots, as Buck Baker had some special tomato juice packed in his car.
Years ago, before cool suits and supplemental oxygen, Buck used to keep cool by swigging on a jar of enhanced tomato juice in his car. Well, one day he was involved in a terrible-looking crash, like this one at Darlington. The tomato juice jar broke and spilled all over him. The first rescue guy to the car looked in, spun right around, and ran back up the embankment to meet the ambulance crew. "No use to hurrying, boys," he said. "Buck's done cut his head clear off."
Of course, Buck Baker didn't win 2 NASCAR championships drinking Bloody Marys when he raced. Sometimes he also drank beer. In a 1999 interview, he told the story of a race at Hillsborough, North Carolina, when he put a jug full of beer in his car to drink during the race. The bumpy dirt surface caused the beer to foam up, and he described the inside of the car as looking like a washing machine. Needless to say, the drivers could handle their alcohol better than the fans. Like in April 1952 at the Columbia Speedway. It was a Saturday night race, and a fan had spent the afternoon drinking in the infield. During the race, this drunk fan got into his car and wanted to leave, so he crossed the track under green and was hit by driver E.C. Ramsey, who got out of his race car and beat the man until police came and brought the drunk to jail. When fans weren't driving drunk on the track, sometimes they were burning it down, like at the Wilson Speedway half-mile dirt track in March 1959, when a fan dropped a lit cigarette under the grandstands, and a fire quickly started. All were safely evacuated before the fire engulfed the entire front stretch grandstands, but only briefly delayed the start of the Cup race, which started once the stands had burned to the ground. Besides fires, hot temperatures were a problem for early drivers. Like in June 1950, when Jimmy Florian won at the half-mile Dayton, Ohio dirt track. With temperatures reaching the mid-80s, he drove the race with no shirt on. That was the only time a driver won with no shirt, but 2 years later, a driver won with no pants. In the 1952 Southern 500, Fonnie Flock won the race wearing shorts. The first night race in NASCAR was at Columbia in June 1951, when Frank Mundy won wearing a Hawaiian shirt. That night, Mundy was driving a car meant for racing, but 2 months earlier he showed up to race in California and hoped to find a ride when he got out there. When he couldn't get one, he went to a car rental agency and rented a year-old Chevy to race. He finished 11th with it, won $25, and returned the car at night so no one would notice the worn tires.
And that number X car is Frank Rebel Mundy. The 1950 Chevy is a rental car, and Frank will return it late tonight so the bald tires won't be noticed.
In July 1951, Herb Thomas won a race in Pennsylvania driving a car numbered 41.5, the only time a car with a fractional number won a NASCAR race. Thomas won 48 Cup races, but one he doesn't get credit for is the time he stole a car from another driver in the middle of a race. At the 1-mile dirt Lakewood Speedway in November 1952, Thomas dominated the race, but with 14 laps to go, broke an axle and stopped on the track. That gave the lead to his brother Donald. From the side of the track, Herb waved his arms and ordered Donald to stop, and when he did, Herb dragged his brother out of the car and took over, leaving his brother standing on the side of the track. Of course, NASCAR penalized with a stop and go for switching drivers on track. By this point, Lee Petty had taken the lead, but Herb chased him down and retook the lead with 7 laps to go, officially getting Donald Thomas his only NASCAR win. While Darlington was the #1 event for NASCAR in those early years, Daytona Beach was a close second. Marshall Teague won at Daytona in February 1951, but near the middle of the race, he had to avoid a fan who ran onto the track to take a picture of the cars coming at him. Teague won again in 1952, when the race was shortened because of rising tides, the only time a race was shortened because the ocean was covering the track. That same weekend in 1952, Tim Flock qualified for the Sportsman race at Daytona before NASCAR officials noticed he didn't have a roll cage in his car. So Tim, his brother Fonte, and a few others built a roll cage out of wood, 2x4s to be exact. Apparently, officials didn't have time to check his work pre-race because Flock went out there and won the race. Afterwards, officials were stunned that he raced a car made of wood, as the rulebook clearly said only metal roll bars were allowed. Hours after news of Flock's win was reported to newspapers, he was disqualified, and the win was given to Jack Smith. Later that year, another Sportsman driver crossed the finish line first but didn't keep the win, and this was by choice. In August at Richmond, Joe Weatherly spun Sam DeRusso on the last lap. Weatherly didn't want to win that way and told NASCAR officials to bring DeRusso to victory lane and give him the money. The crowd gave Weatherly a standing ovation for his honor. Amazingly, this wasn't the only time this happened. In a race for the short track division at Toronto in June 1957, Jim Reed accidentally wrecked Rex White on the last lap. He refused the win, and White was awarded the victory. Most cars were standard American passenger cars, but some were foreign-made. Throughout the decade, cars on the track included Volkswagens, Porsches, and a Jaguar, which won at the Linden Airport, with Al Keller driving in June 1954. Fireball Roberts drove a car with white wall tires at Daytona in 1955. The Carl Kiekhaefer owned Chryslers had eyes painted on their headlights. The first power team in NASCAR at one point, Kiekhaefer's car had nothing on them as punishment. When the team went through a slump in the summer of 1956, Kiekhaefer told his team they weren't doing well enough to carry his name and ordered the cars painted plain white. He also told the team they couldn't use the haulers to get to the races, with a crewman saying, quote, "Mr. K said he didn't want to see his name connected with the cars. They would be slaughtered." When Speedy Thompson won at Shelby in July, Kiekhaefer put the sponsors back on. Arguably the most successful driver of the decade was Lee Petty, the first 3-time champion. Normally well-liked, the entire Petty family got into a fight with Tiny Lund at Greensboro in April 1957. Lee Petty was joined by his sons Richard and Maurice in taking on the 6'5" Lund. The fight was broken up when Lee's wife hit Tiny over the head with her purse, which had extra weight because there was a pistol inside it. While Richard was only 19 years old back then, he had already spent time on the track. At the half-mile dirt track in High Point, North Carolina in June 1953, a 15-year-old Petty made his first laps in a cup race on the hood of his father's car.
So I jump up on the windshield, try to clean the mud off. Well, here comes the pace car. Out we go. We make a lap around the racetrack. Time we get back, he goes down pit road. By then, I got the windshield clean on his side anyway. I jump off, and he goes on from there.
So you rode a lap on the hood?
Yeah, on the hood. Johnny Bruner was the chief NASCAR guy at that time. I didn't even have a pit pass, man.
Oh, no.
I wasn't even supposed to.
While Lee Petty could see clearly that night, he couldn't see anything in August 1956 in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Drivers said the track conditions were too dusty and the lights too dim for the Saturday night race. After 34 laps, Petty had enough, stopping his car on the track and grabbing the red flag to stop the race himself. The fellow drivers were happy to stop considering the bad conditions. Track promoters quickly gave out refunds, which was the only thing that stopped the 6,000 fans from rioting. In the convertible race at Asheville-Weaverville in September 1956, the race had to be stopped 20 laps from the finish when all but one car crashed. Curtis Turner was the only one left. In 1953, Tim Flock found a way to get kids to follow his team when he had a co-driver, a monkey named Jocko Flacco.
Jocko Flacco ran in 8 Grand National races with me. My car owner, Ted Chester in Atlanta, Georgia, thought of buying an African monkey. He had little goggles built for him, a cloth helmet, a suit, had Jocko on it. And on my Hudson Hornet back in 1952, on his side of the car, we had Jocko Flacco, and on the driver's side, Tim Flock. On the 8th race, we was running the mile track at Raleigh, North Carolina. We had a trap door back then. We pull the chain, you could see your right front tire. Jocko had been watching me pull that chain for about 60, 70 laps. He got out under 2 belts, went down in that hole, and a pebble hit him right here, and he come running back up in the car and got on my shoulders. So I had to come in the pits, and it's the only time in history that a Grand National car stopped to put a monkey out of it. And that's the truth. It cost me $750.
Darlington in the Southern 500 was the wildest event on the schedule. The track even had to build a jail in the infield to hold fans who stepped over the line. The first year, they built the jail right before the race, and the concrete was still wet. So wet, in fact, that the first 2 people arrested simply slid a few concrete blocks out and escaped back into the infield. There's an old English legend about Lady Godiva, who rode through town on a horse, wearing nothing at all. Darlington has its own legend that's been told for decades. At some point in the 1950s, a woman and her husband went to the Southern 500. After some heavy drinking, the woman caught her husband with another woman. She then took off all her clothes, got on a motorcycle, rode around the infield before making a lap on the track, and left through a tunnel and drove into town, never to be caught by the police.
Somehow, she zoomed past the gate guards, roared up onto the racetrack, and made one hot lap. much to the delight of the mob in the infield. She streaked out the gate onto Highway 34 and was never seen again at Darlington. Neither was her husband. How about that?
In 1956, it was reported that another nude woman ran through the infield before getting caught by police and covered with a blanket. This inspired a few others to do it over the years, and in 1962, it was reported that one woman had finally made her ride on a motor scooter. Then there was the man who sold oranges in the infield. Track officials were confused why so many people bought fruit. It turned out the farmer had injected vodka into the oranges with a syringe, and police shut him down. One year, a kid with a slingshot was shooting cherry bombs on the track. And then there was Eddie Skinner, who pitted early in the 1955 Southern 500 to complain to his crew that the cigarette lighter in his car wasn't working. Perhaps that would have helped Curtis Turner, who later in that same race was lighting a cigarette under caution and hit Fonnie Flock, which bent a tie rod and put him out of the race. Sometime around 1955, a reverend told his congregation that he had a vision from God that he would win the Southern 500. So the church bought him a new Ford to enter the race. He made the field but ran well off the pace, and afterwards gave his car to the mechanic who helped him. Cale Yarborough made his NASCAR debut in the 1957 Southern 500, but he was only 17 years old, and officials wouldn't let him race. So another driver pulled into the pits on the pace laps and let Cale drive, hoping the officials wouldn't notice. He was quickly black flagged and kicked out. After finishing 20th in the 1951 Southern 500, George Seeger was driving back to California with his car owner Tony Sampo. They got in an argument at a gas station in Phoenix, and when Seeger went to use the bathroom, Sampo drove off and left his driver stranded at the gas station. NASCAR has come a long way since the days when men drove their race cars on public roads to get to the track, but it was the 1950s, with its wild moments, that laid the groundwork for a 75-year institution.